Elena's breath came in shallow, measured bursts, her eyes locked on the figure in the center of the room, the blue light reflecting off its mask, creating a halo of menace and anticipation. The hum of the machinery had escalated into a roar, vibrating, through the walls, through her bones, through every nerve-ending warning her that every second counted and hesitation could be fatal. She adjusted her stance, her boots sliding slightly on the cold metal floor, each movement calculated, deliberate, every muscle coiled, ready for action. The figure extended its hands forward, and the screens on the walls shifted all at once, a cascade of symbols, lines, numbers, and images flashing faster than her mind could process. They formed a pattern, a language, a code that seemed alive, that seemed to reach into her very consciousness. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears, and she felt a pull toward the center, as though invisible strings were tugging at her, forcing her to confront the unknown. The shadow that had haunted her since the shot appeared again, along the edges of the room, moving with silent grace and purpose, its presence adding a layer of tension she could feel pressing against her chest. Her comm crackled violently, sending fragments of static voices, distorted instructions, nothing coherent, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. The figure spoke again, its voice metallic resonating through the room inside her mind, and this time she understood the words, or at least the intent: a challenge, a test, a demand for proof of skill, courage, and resolve. She swallowed hard, knowing that she could not retreat. She could not hesitate. She had come too far. The impossible shot had been only a prelude to what was required. Now Elena stepped forward, the pull growing stronger, the lights pulsing faster, every screen bending her perception, stretching the room into a space that felt both infinite and impossible. The shadow flitted closer to her side, moving in perfect synchronization as though it were part of the test, as much as the figure at the center. She felt the weight of every calculation, every tactical decision she had ever made, pressing down on her, knowing that misstep would mean failure. Not just for herself, but for everything. She represented. A sudden vibration surged through the floor, the hum crystallizing into a single sharp note, piercing through her ears, and she instinctively dropped low, the lights flickering, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The figure remained motionless, except for the faintest movements of the mask, tilting ever so slightly as though acknowledging her reaction, the air around it thrumming with power beyond comprehension. Elena's eyes flicked to the shadow, and she saw it pause as if waiting for her next move, signaling her or warning her, or both, she could not tell. She inched forward, her rifle still raised her finger, brushing the trigger, but held back every sense, screaming that this was no ordinary engagement, that bullets would not win the day, that the challenge required more than strength, skill, or courage alone. She reached the center of the room, her boots brushing the glowing floor, the pulsing lights reflecting in her eyes, and for the first time she felt the magnitude of the moment, the culmination of everything that had led her here, the impossible shot, the doubts, the shadows, the whispers of the forest. The figure suddenly moved its arms in a sweeping arc, and the lights responded as though dancing to an unseen rhythm, the air vibrating so strongly Elena had to brace herself against the floor. Her mind raced calculations, scenarios, contingencies, escape, plans, countermeasures, every second compressed into a single infinite pulse of awareness. She felt the pull of the shadow behind her brush against her sleeve, almost tangible, guiding, pushing warning. And she realized that she could not do this alone, that the forces in the room were interacting with her presence, the challenge and the unknown, in a way she had to respect or be destroyed. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the far side of the room, the lights flickering violently, and Elena spun her rifle toward it, but there was nothing. The shadow vanished into the edges again, leaving only a lingering sense of movement unseen. Yet she sensed its intent in the vibrations through the floor, through the hum, through her own heartbeat. She took a deep breath and adjusted her stance, centering herself, feeling every muscle, every nerve, every calculation aligning into a single moment of potential action. The figure raised its hands higher, and the blue light intensified, filling the room with a searing glow that made her squint and feel the hairs on her arms stand on end. The symbols on. The walls now moved in patterns she could comprehend, partially code and partially warning, but the meaning crystal clear if she could act decisively. The shadow darted across the floor, trailing a faint blur of motion, almost like a guide, a hint at what to do next. And Elena realized instinctively that timing would be everything, the difference between success and annihilation. She took one step forward, the floor vibrating beneath her boots, the hum a constant presence, her senses stretched to their limit. And then she lunged, her movements precise, rapid, confident, despite the impossibility of the moment. The figure reacted immediately, arms sweeping through the air, the screens flaring in response, the energy in the room folding around, her in waves of pressure and light. And Elena adjusted every move in response, following a rhythm she could feel but not see completely, the shadow moving alongside her like a silent partner in the dance of danger. The light intensified, a blinding pulse, the hum now, a roar in her ears, every sense overloaded. Yet her mind focused, narrowed to the singular point of action. She fired her rifle not at the figure, not at the shadow, but at the sequence of lights on the floor, calculating trajectory, timing effect. The bullet struck perfectly, the pulse of the room faltering for a fraction of a second, the figure's mask tilting sharply as though surprised, and the shadow flickered like static on a screen. The pause was enough for her to step. Further into the center, the lights pulsing irregularly, the hum lowering slightly, and she realized that she had not won yet, but she had passed a threshold. She had crossed the first barrier of the impossible challenge, and whatever came next would be even greater, testing everything she had prepared for, every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage she could muster. And she knew that Thelina stood in the center of the room, the blue light washing over her, the hum still resonating through, her body and every nerve on edge. She could feel the energy of the place coiling around her like a living thing, her boots pressed against the glowing floor, her rifle still raised, but her mind focused on the figure, the shadow, and the impossible moment that had brought her here. The walls pulsed with light and symbols, flowing in patterns that seemed to breathe and shift in response to her presence, as if the bunker itself were aware of her every movement. The figure moved, suddenly stepping forward, its mask gleaming in the bright light, revealing glimpses of human features beneath but distorted, enhanced something beyond human comprehension. Elena's pulse pounded her instincts, screaming to react. Yet she held herself steady, every muscle taut, her mind calculating the next sequence of possibilities. The shadow darted close around her, almost like a whisper, a phantom guiding her subtly through the waves of energy and tension that filled the room. A low metallic voice filled the chamber, clear, resonating through her chest. The words simple but heavy with meaning. "Do you understand the challenge?" Elena swallowed hard, knowing that comprehension alone was not enough. She had to act to survive, to prove herself, to overcome the impossible. She nodded slightly, her mind racing through every step she had taken, every calculation, every shot, every instinct leading her to this confrontation, and she realized that everything had prepared her for this moment. The figure raised its hands, and the machinery responded, the lights flashing faster, the screens now alive with movement symbols flowing like liquid through circuits, the hum rising into a piercing crescendo. Elena felt the pressure on her chest, on her mind, on her senses, and she knew that one wrong move could trigger disaster. The shadow moved closer to her side, brushing against her sleeve, a silent reminder of timing and precision, and she took a deep breath, centering herself, focusing on the rhythm of the room, the flow of energy, the patterns she had begun to understand. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but she did not shoot. Instead, she lunged forward, pressing her body low against the floor, the shadow moving with her, guiding her toward a cluster of panels, the lights reflecting in her eyes, her mind racing. She reached the controls, adjusting dials, switches, sequences she had no right to understand. Yet somehow her instincts knew what to do. The screens pulsed wildly, reacting to her every touch. The hum lowering and then rising in waves as if testing her resolve again and again. The figure advanced closer, the glow from its mask bathing her in light so bright it nearly blinded her. Yet she remained steady, adjusting a final control sequence, and the hum faltered. For the first time, a brief silence cutting through the chaos like a knife. She stood up fully. Her rifle raised, the shadow circling now above and around her, and the figure paused, its hands lowering slightly, a silent acknowledgement that she had passed the test, the first threshold of impossible skill, courage, and understanding. The bunker itself seemed to sigh, a vibration flowing through the floor walls and ceiling, the symbols stabilizing the lights, softening, and the pulse of energy calming into a steady rhythm. Elena lowered her rifle slowly, her eyes fixed on the figure, and in that moment, the mask shifted, revealing fully human eye, final revelation of the figure, and the purpose of the bunker was imminent. The air had grown colder as Elena stood frozen, the forest before her, holding its breath as if waiting for something unseen to move. First, every sound around her seemed sharper. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of insects, the faint rattle of loose gravel beneath her boots. She adjusted her stance, her rifle steady, though her pulse drummed like thunder beneath her skin. The faint metallic click still echoed in her mind, a warning or perhaps a countdown she could not tell. The shadow she had seen earlier had vanished again, but she could feel it there, watching her from somewhere deep in the maze of trees. The general's voice crackled faintly through her comm static, distorting his tone into something harsh and unreadable. He ordered her to report. But Elena remained silent, her instincts screaming that any sound could give her away. She scanned the tree line slowly, each movement calculated, deliberate, her eyes flicking from one shadow to the next. But there was nothing, not even a flicker of motion, and yet the feeling of being watched refused to fade. She inhaled deeply, the cold air burning her lungs as she weighed her options, retreat or advance, and she knew that only one would give her answers. She crouched low, moving forward one step at a time. Her rifle raised the earth soft beneath her boots, and her breath shallow. The forest seemed alive with whispers, as though the trees themselves were speaking in a language older than time. The light filtered through the canopy in broken shards, painting the ground in gold and shadow. And she thought she saw something move between the shafts of light, a brief distortion, as though the air itself had bent around something invisible. Her finger tightened slightly against the trigger, but she held back, unwilling to reveal herself too soon. A faint hum reached her ears, low and mechanical, blending with the rustle of the leaves. She froze, tilting her head to listen, and realized it was coming from below her somewhere. Beneath the forest floor, she stepped lightly, her heel striking a metallic surface hidden beneath the soil. And she felt the vibration travel up through her leg, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Her pulse quickened, and she knelt, brushing away the layer of dirt to reveal what looked like a metal plate, its surface dull and scarred as though it had been there for years. She reached into her pack for a small scanner, and the device flickered to life, casting a dim blue glow across her. Gloves. The readings made no sense, layers of circuitry deeper than her equipment could read, signals looping endlessly like echoes trapped underground. She frowned, whispering to herself as she recalibrated, and for a moment she thought she heard movement. Again, this time closer, the faintest scrape of boots on stone. Her muscles tensed. She looked up, her eyes scanning the forest, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone yet. The air felt charged heavy with the weight of unseen presence. She placed the scanner back into her pack and rose slowly, rifle ready. Her finger brushing against the trigger guard, a branch snapped to her right, and she spun toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. The forest stretched before her, silent again, as if mocking her for reacting, and she took a slow step forward, her heart pounding. The shadow reappeared for the briefest instant, gliding between two trees, and she fired. The shot echoed through the valley, sharp and deafening. Birds exploded from the canopy in a flurry of wings and color, and the echo bounced off the cliffs again and again, until only silence remained. She held her breath, waiting, listening. But the shadow was gone. Her comm crackled again, this time with the voice of one of her team members, breathless, reporting that the sensors had picked up movement near the old bunker site half a kilometer east. Elena's eyes narrowed. The metal plate beneath her boots suddenly made sense. The forest had grown over an old facility, long abandoned according to the maps, but if there was movement there, then something or someone was using it again. She whispered into her comm, telling them to hold position until she gave the signal, then turned toward the east, her every step deliberate and silent. The terrain grew steeper as she advanced the ground, shifting from soil to stone, jagged and uneven. The wind howled through the narrow pass like a voice of warning, but Elena pressed on her focus, unwavering. She could see faint impressions. In the dirt, footprints too fresh to be old and too many to belong to one person. Her grip tightened on her rifle as she followed the trail, her breathing steady and her eyes sharp. She could feel the temperature drop the deeper she went, until her breath formed faint clouds in the air, and the silence around her became suffocating. At last she saw it, a break in the ground, where the old concrete bunker stood, half collapsed its entrance, hidden by vines and fallen debris. She approached cautiously, brushing aside branches and dirt, revealing the faded emblem of a forgotten unit etched into the wall. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. Elena hesitated for only a second before slipping inside. Her rifle raised her, boots soundless against the cold floor. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint hum of machinery that should not have been working after so many years. She moved deeper, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, the corridor ahead splitting into two narrow tunnels. The flickering lights above her buzzed faintly, each pulse echoing through the silence, and she could hear something deeper in the bunker, a rhythmic, metallic sound like gears turning in slow, deliberate motion. She followed it, her breath shallow and her finger resting lightly against the trigger. The walls around her were lined with control panels, cracked screens and cables that pulsed faintly with light, as though the bunker were still alive, watching her every move. Sudden burst of static crackled through her earpiece, and the voice of her team dissolved into noise. She stopped, her pulse racing, realizing that she was alone, the signal lost. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the metal walls, and for the first time she felt something deeper than fear, something ancient and primal, like the feeling of standing on the edge of an abyss. She turned a corner and froze the corridor ahead, ending in a massive sealed door, faint blue light leaking from the edges. And on the floor before it, fresh footprints leading directly inside. Elena's grip tightened, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. But there was no turning back now. The door before her was beginning to open slowly, soundlessly. The light within growing brighter until it filled the corridor with an eerie glow. She took a step forward, her rifle steady, her breath caught between fear and anticipation, and as the gap widened, she saw the outline of a figure standing beyond it, motionless, waiting. and she realized she was not the hunter here, but the one being hunted, and the truth of what she had uncovered was about to reveal itself in a way she could never have prepared. For Elena stepped closer to the massive door. The blue light, spilling over her boots and casting elongated shadows along the walls, the hum from within growing stronger, vibrating through the metal floor beneath her as if the bunker itself were alive and aware of her presence. She adjusted her rifle, her finger, hovering over the trigger, every nerve in her body alert to the slightest movement. The air smelled faintly of ozone and oil, a metallic tang that made her stomach tighten, and she knew instinctively that whatever awaited her behind this door was far beyond anything she had faced before. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, echoing through the silence as she reached out and brushed her fingers along the cold edge of the door. It shuddered under her touch, a subtle warning or perhaps an invitation. She paused, listening, and for a moment, the hum stopped, leaving a ringing silence that pressed against her eardrums. She took a shallow breath and pushed the door further open, slipping inside her boots, soundless, on the smooth metal floor. The room beyond was vast, impossibly so, stretching into shadows that swallowed the light at the edges. The walls were lined with machinery, blinking faintly screens displaying incomprehensible symbols and patterns that seemed to shift as she looked at them. Her eyes scanned the room, and then she saw it. The figure standing motionless in the center, bathed in the eerie blue light, its features obscured by shadows, and a hood pulled low over its face. Elena's grip on her rifle tightened, her muscles coiled, ready to react. The figure raised a hand slowly, and she froze the motion, deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. The hum shifted into a low rhythmic pulse, resonating through the room, and Elena felt it in her chest, in her bones, as if the sound itself were alive. Her mind raced, calculating possibilities. The figure could be human-enhanced machine or something else entirely, something that should not exist yet. Here it was, waiting for her as though it had expected her all along. A sudden flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow behind the figure, and she pivoted her rifle toward it. But it vanished before she could take aim. The room felt larger, somehow impossibly vast. The walls stretching into darkness that defied sense, and Elena realized that the bunker was more than it appeared, a labyrinth, a trap, a test, or perhaps a prison for something far older than any soldier's training could contend with. She took another careful step forward, each one measured her breath shallow and controlled. The figure spoke without moving its lips, a voice inside her head, cold and clear, echoing through her mind, and she stumbled back in surprise, the words foreign and yet somehow comprehensible, warning her to turn back or face consequences beyond reckoning. Elena's pulse raced. She gritted her teeth, refusing to be cowed by something she could not yet understand, every instinct urging her forward toward the truth of what she had uncovered. Her calm craw. The sun had barely begun to cast its pale light over the jagged mountains when Captain Elena Marquez stepped onto the cold metal platform of the firing range. Her boots clicked against the surface, echoing into the emptiness around her, and she could feel the weight of every eye in the camp pressing down on her. Each soldier seemed to hold their breath as the general himself approached, his long coat flapping in the morning wind, and his eyes narrowed with doubt. Elena's heart raced, not with fear, but with the pulse of challenge that had carried her through every impossible shot she had ever taken. She set her sights on the target far beyond the ridge, a tiny black dot that seemed like nothing more than a speck in the infinite distance. The general's voice cut through the quiet with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. He said she could not hit 4,000 meters, and there was no hesitation in his tone, only certainty, as if the world itself would bend to his disbelief. Elena clenched her jaw and lifted her rifle. The stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly, but not from uncertainty, from anticipation. Every movement had been drilled into her from dawn to dusk since. She had joined the elite marksman corps, and yet the enormity of the challenge made the air feel thicker with every passing second. Her team moved silently around her, adjusting instruments, checking wind speed and humidity, whispering calculations. That felt like a secret language only they could understand. The wind shifted over the valley below, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and dust, and she imagined the bullet slicing through the air, unstoppable, precise, as it left her barrel, and her mind raced through every variable, the curve of the earth, the pressure of the atmosphere, the subtle vibration that could throw a perfect shot into chaos. She inhaled slowly, feeling the barrel vibrate slightly against her shoulder, and she could hear the soft murmur of the soldiers behind her, some doubting, some silently rooting for her. She adjusted her sight, focusing through the scope where the tiny dot waited at the edge of impossibility. Her finger hovered over the trigger, and time seemed to stretch as the general watched silently, like a predator assessing the potential of his prey. A sudden gust of wind rattled the instruments around her, and she blinked. Trying to compensate, the target seemed to dance, and the distance felt infinite. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the drumbeat of anticipation that seemed to echo off the mountains like some ancient warning. She thought of every lesson her mentor had drilled into her, every sleepless night spent adjusting for microsecond changes in trajectory, and yet a part of her wondered if it would be enough to defy the impossible. The soldiers whispered among themselves, the words barely audible as they questioned silently if anyone could ever manage such a shot, even in legend. Elena's eyes narrowed, and she steadied her breathing, focusing on the target, on the challenge, on the moment, and a strange calm settled over her, as if the world had paused to witness the impossible. She pressed the trigger, slowly, the click sharp, against the silence around her, and the rifle bucked slightly against her shoulder, sending a ripple through her muscles. For a heartbeat she waited, imagining the bullet flying across the 4,000 meters across the chasm, across the doubts and disbeliefs, and she could hear the general muttering under his breath, almost like a spell that would turn failure into certainty. But then she saw it. The tiniest movement in the distance, a shimmer almost invisible against the sun, and her pulse quickened because it was too early, too fast, but she could not tell if it was the wind or the bullet slicing through the air like a phantom. The soldiers froze, and Elena's chest tightened as the seconds stretched impossibly long, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. And then she heard the sound, the distant echo of the bullet breaking the quiet of the valley. And it arrived later than she expected, a fraction of a second after her eyes had already confirmed what she had suspected. Her lips pressed together, trying to hold back a grin as the impossible unfolded before everyone's eyes. But the general did not move. He did not speak. He only stared, a flicker of something crossing his face before it disappeared, and the silence grew heavier as everyone waited for something to happen, something that no one could have predicted. Elena lowered her rifle slowly, feeling every muscle in her body relax, while tension and disbelief battled in the faces of the soldiers around her. And she realized that this was more than a shot. This was a statement, a defiance against certainty, against doubt, against the limits imposed by anyone who had not dared to try. The target had been hit, but the story was far from over, because the air still held secrets, and the mountains still whispered challenges that no one had yet faced. A shadow moved across the ridge beyond the target, and Elena squinted, trying to focus her eyes on the dark shape, a figure perhaps watching her success, with intentions unknown, and she felt a shiver run down her spine because the shot had been the first step into something far larger than she had imagined. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, and the silence of the valley pressed against her, ears making every heartbeat sound like a drum of warning, and she knew in that instant that the day was only beginning. She stepped back from the platform, her boots barely making a sound, as soldiers began to murmur among themselves, each word filled with awe and fear. And yet the general's eyes did not leave her. He seemed to weigh her every movement, as if calculating a plan that had nothing to do with the impossible shot. Elena sensed the tension building like a storm on the horizon, and, for the first time, she wondered if her skill alone would be enough to navigate the challenges that had just begun to emerge from the shadows of her triumph. The platform trembled slightly as the wind shifted again, carrying whispers of unseen forces. And Elena looked back at the rifle still warm in her hands, knowing that this moment was the threshold of something far larger, something that would test not only her aim, but her courage and resolve. And she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself for what was coming, knowing that the valley would demand more than a single impossible shot. And then she heard it. The faintest sound almost drowned by the wind. A metallic click echoing from the ridge like a warning, like an announcement that the story was far from over, and she froze her eyes, locking on the distant silhouette that moved just beyond sight. And she realized that the challenge had only begun, and the next step would not be measured in meters but in survival and cunning and everything she had yet to discover. If you want, I can continue part 2 in the same style, keeping the suspense and tension escalating, and maintain the 6-part structure. Do you want me to go ahead with that? Elena could feel the tension in the air, thick and almost tangible, as she stepped off the platform, her boots crunching against the gravel in a rhythm that felt too loud in the quiet morning. The shadow on the ridge had not moved, but it had grown larger somehow, an impossible perception that made her pulse quicken. She glanced at her team, and they were frozen, as if each soldier was waiting for a command that would not come. The general remained a silent figure at the edge of the range, his eyes sharp and unreadable, and Elena wondered if he had seen the same thing she had. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke, or perhaps something more metallic that made her stomach tighten. She adjusted her jacket, feeling the chill run through her, and every instinct told her to move forward. Yet the ridge seemed impossibly far. The soldiers behind her murmured softly, their voices like distant echoes bouncing off the mountains, and Elena's mind raced, calculating distances, angles, speed, and the tiny variables that could change everything in a single heartbeat. She moved cautiously along the ridge line, every step deliberate, and measured her rifle ready in her hands like an extension of her body. She could hear the wind whispering through the rocks and the trees swaying slightly, as if trying to warn her of something unseen. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement, for any sign of what had caused that shadow to appear, and every instinct screamed that she was being watched, yet by whom she could not tell. The general's voice finally cut through the tension, low and deliberate, saying nothing about her shot, only asking questions that seemed meant to probe more than instruct. "What is that?" she whispered under her breath, unsure if she meant the figure or the feeling creeping along her spine. The soldiers exchanged glances, but no one moved forward, and Elena realized that she was the only one willing to step into the unknown, the only one whose skill and courage could face whatever lay ahead. She paused behind a large boulder, catching her breath and peering across the valley. The shadow had disappeared, or perhaps it had always been part of the mountains, shifting light or a trick of the wind, but she could not shake the feeling that it was alive, waiting for something, waiting for her. The trees whispered again, and she thought she saw the movement of branches not from the wind, but from some presence lurking just beyond her vision. Elena continued her careful advance, the gravel shifting under her boots. The valley below, stretching endlessly, like a void that promised danger and opportunity, all at once. She reached a narrow outcrop and leaned against the rock, feeling its cold, rough surface grounding her in the moment. She adjusted her scope, scanning the distance. Beyond the target, and the wind carried the faint sound of movement, almost imperceptible but distinct enough to set her nerves on edge. Suddenly, a metallic glint caught her eye.